My name is Nia McAllister, and I'm the Public Programs Manager at the Museum of the African Diaspora. And as we gather here today, it is essential to acknowledge the times that we're living in and the current circumstances that we're all navigating. MOAD stands with Black Lives Matter in recognizing and condemning white supremacy and the ongoing systemic violence against Black people. We honor and mourn the senseless murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, Casey Goodson Jr., Patrick Warren Sr., Andre Hill, Daunte Wright, Anthony Thompson Jr., Ma'Khia Bryant, and so many others who've lost their lives from police brutality and racial injustice, including those whose names we do not know. We want to acknowledge that MOAD's commitment to racial justice is ongoing, and as such, we will continue to say these names to hold space and to honor these victims. I also want to acknowledge the spaces that we're occupying. Though we're gathered virtually, many of us are settlers, immigrants, or descendants of those forcibly brought to this continent. And our institutions were founded on the exclusions and erasures of the indigenous peoples on whose lands we're located. It's with deep respect that MOAD acknowledges that even in virtual space, we here in what we call San Francisco and Oakland reside on unceded Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone lands. And we thank these indigenous communities of the Bay Area and beyond who've stewarded this land throughout the generations. Now, today it is such an honor to be inviting Natalie Baszile and Karen Washington to be in conversation in celebration of Natalie's latest book, We Are Each Other's Harvest. I'm going to introduce both of our speakers today. Natalie Baszile is the author of Queen Sugar, which has been adapted for a 5th television season, co-produced by Ava DuVernay and Oprah Winfrey. Natalie has had residencies at the Ragdale Foundation, Virginia Center of the Arts, Hedgebrook, and the Jurassic Residence Arts Program, where she received the SF Film and the Bonnie Ratner Fellowships. Karen Washington is a farmer and activist. She is the co-owner and farmer at Rise and Root Farm in Chester, New York. In 2021, she co-founded Black Urban Growers, an organization supporting growers in both urban and rural settings. And in 2012, Ebony Magazine voted her one of the 100 most influential African Americans in the country. And in 2014, she was the recipient of the James Beard Leadership Award. We're very grateful today to be co-presenting this program in partnership with the California African American Museum in Los Angeles. And so I want to pass it off to Susan Anderson, who is the history curator and program manager at CAAM in LA, to give a few words before we jump into our conversation. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you so much, Nia. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes. I want to mention that our mission at the California African American Museum is to research, collect, preserve, and interpret for public enrichment the history, art, and culture of African Americans with an emphasis on California and the West. And we're so pleased to co-present today's special program with MOAD. We're committed to exploring themes that connect African Americans with their deep history in relation to the land and to the natural world. And in that vein, I'd just like to mention we're developing an exhibition that showcases radical leisure and African American beach culture. Another exhibit, World Without End, the George Washington Carver Project, will examine the impact of a groundbreaking scientist and artist on contemporary art and environmental science. And the exhibit, We Are Not Strangers Here, explores African American histories in rural California. So we're so happy to be aligned with the vital topic that will be discussed today by author Natalie Baszile in conversation with farmer and activist Karen Washington. We Are Each Other's Harvest, celebrating African American farmers' land and legacy. It's such a beautiful title from a poem by Gwendolyn Brooks. I am going to join the audience. Now it's time for the main event. Please, everybody, welcome Natalie Baszile and Karen Washington.
Hi, Karen.
Hey, Natalie. Good to see you.
Always good to see you too. So shall we just jump in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Well, first I have to tell the audience that It is such a pleasure for me to share this moment with you and to have a chance for us to be in conversation together, because for many years I have heard your name and knew of your work, and knew that you were at the forefront of this movement. So it's really just an honor for me to be able to chat with you today.
Thanks, Natalie, for those kind words. I see myself as an agitator, so to be in your presence and to talk about your book gives me great pleasure.
Thank you. Well, shall I start off with a brief reading, or?
Definitely, yeah.
Okay, why don't I do that? All right. So I am just going to read a little bit from the foreword to the book. For those of you who have not come across the book yet, We Are Each Other's Harvest is really, I like to describe it as a chorus of voices, telling the story of African Americans' connection to the land through farming, through land ownership, through land stewardship. And the book is a compilation of poems and portraits and essays that I commissioned or acquired the rights to, as well as first-person narratives with a number of farmers. And I know Karen is reading the book, and I'm sure we'll jump into that and talk about some of the voices. But I'd like to start just by sharing a little bit of the foreword that I wrote, kind of explaining to readers what motivated me to take on this subject. And I'll just read, really it's just the first page, it's a couple of paragraphs. Drive east along Interstate 80 from San Francisco towards Sacramento, past vast acres of alfalfa, watermelon, and rice, and you'll eventually come upon a 2-story mural of a solitary figure squinting out across the land. Dressed in a plaid shirt, jeans, and work boots, a tuft of gray hair peeking out beneath the baseball cap, the figure kneels in a patch of sunflowers. With one hand, the figure cradles a husky yellow Labrador. The other hand points out to the horizon. The figure is a farmer. He is a middle-aged man and he's white. The artist who painted the 20 by 20 foot mural titled Stewards of the Soil says that she meant to pay tribute to the farmers in her community. I don't fault her for wanting to honor them. Farming is difficult work. And I acknowledge that her mural reflects the picture most people have in mind when they envision the American farmer. And yet, every time I drive past it, I can't help but think it tells only part of the story. Surely, somewhere across the thousands of acres, there must be a handful of Black and brown farmers. Who are they? What stories might they tell if given a chance? So that is just a little bit of the snippet that opens the book. But, I was reminded of that opening. I'm coming to you from North Carolina, and flying out here, I had a chance to fly across the country. And, looking out of the plane window, as I look down at America, I was reminded of that, and I was really struck by the fact that here we have millions and millions of acres of farmland in this country, land in this country, and to think that Black and brown people's ownership of that land is less than 2%, was just shocking to me all over again. So I just wanted to say that, yet again, I was reminded of the history of this country, the reality that we face, and also the opportunity. So we can start there.
So I'm glad you brought that up, Natalie, because I am from New York City, born and raised in New York City, and farming was never mentioned in my family. I mean, it was always go to school, get good grades. And that even in school, when you even mentioned farming, it was always equated with slavery. And it was something that you did not want to do. I mean, I know parents, African-American parents did not even want their children to even go down south, even in, as a child thinking about if you went down south, you did something wrong. So there's a relationship to farming, being down south. It was a negative connotation. So how I found my way to be a farmer, I think it was definitely had to be the ancestors or someone pushing me in that direction, because I didn't get it from a family member, nobody in my family. My relationship to food was the fact that my mother was a great cook. We had 3 meals. My father was a produce manager. So we had food on our table each and every day. But as far as growing my own food or thinking about growing my own food was not a dream. It was not a plan in my life.
And so what made you, Karen, what made you decide to pursue this?
That's a question that's been asked me so many times. And I think the fact that when I moved to the Bronx, I had a huge backyard. And the neighbors to my left, they decided to put a lawn. Neighbors on my right, they wanted to just tear up the lawn and put down cement. And I said, you know what? I have this area of land. Let me try and grow something. And so I always tell the story. There's 3 things that I want to grow. Tomatoes, because they were tomatoes. I hated tomatoes and they were pale. Eggplant, because it sounded funky. And collard greens. I had to go collard greens as an African American. That was a staple. And when I found out that I could grow something, and it was the tomato that turned my world, because it grew on a vine and not in the store. It was red and not pink, and it tastes like a fruit. I was hooked. And also, I guess we'll talk more about just the landscape of food generally in my neighborhood wasn't good. Wasn't good. So.
And so how, I would love to know, when you tasted that first tomato, what did that make you think? And I guess I also would love to know from you, how did you deal with the narrative that you had been raised with about farming being, a certain kind of labor that Black people were trying to get away from? How did you deal with that? And then how did your family deal with that when you came back and said, I want to start growing food and I want to be a farmer?
Well, first of all, I'll take the first question about the taste of that tomato. Ooh, baby. When I bit into that tomato, I felt, and the sunshine, the juices. I never tasted something so incredible. It was so sweet. It was so juicy. And then, trying to convey that into thinking about, is this something I can do? Is this something I can grow? And while I was growing food in my backyard, there were challenges that were happening in New York City, because at one time, New York City had over 15,000 vacant lots, mostly in low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color. And so many of us who had got no resources from the city gathered together and turned those empty lots into community gardens. So that's where I got my energy to expand from my backyard into community gardening. And a lot of the knowledge I got was hands-on. I either got books, or most of the elders in community gardens came from the South or from the Caribbean. And so getting a chance to listen to their stories about how to grow food really, really encouraged me to try to grow my own food. And once I learned that I could grow something and the taste was totally different, and the effect, believe it or not, that it has on your body, it's totally different when you are used to eating junk food, processed food, and then all of a sudden you're eating something that you've grown with your own hands. Your body takes on this metamorphosis that is totally different. It tells you that this is something that's right for you.
Yeah.
And then, pursuing my second career, because I was a physical therapist for my first career, my second career as farming, and seeing my family and friends, first of all, make fun of me, but then saw my intention and then really started to support the work that I was doing.
Mhm, mhm. You know, it's so interesting you would say that. I think one of the things that's interesting to me, and I feel like this movement has been gaining momentum for years, and I feel like finally this wave is cresting. I remember years ago, really when I was working on Queen Sugar, I would hear from Black people in LA, where I lived at the time, but really all across the country, but in northern cities or in Midwestern cities, who were talking about going back down to the South. And I remember, you know, people starting to talk about this idea of going back to land that had been in their families for generations. And, you know, they weren't just going back because the cost of living was more affordable. There seemed to be a real pull to get back to the soil and get back to the land. And I remember, and this was like 20 years ago, and I remember thinking, what is going on here? What is calling people back, you know, back to the land and back to the South in particular? And I can tell you, like right now I'm in North Carolina, and I will say that there is something very, you can feel it, you know, you can really feel what it means to be back in these Southern communities. I'm in Durham right now, but the proximity to these rural spaces is a real thing. And it's what I was trying to capture in this book. Not that I'm necessarily saying that we all have to go back down south, but I am curious to hear from you what your experience was like when you returned to the soil in Georgia, and even when you returned to the soil in upstate New York for Rise and Root Farm, because I think that people are looking for something. And I tried to talk about that in this book, but I would love to hear from you as someone who, you know, has made that journey, what that's like.
Natalie, I think I found my sense of belonging in 2008 when I was able to go out to California, believe it or not, Santa Cruz, California, for this program called CASFIS, the Center for Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems. It's a 6-month program. At that time, you know, you were living in a tent and you were learning how to grow food organically. And I remember the first time I stepped on, you know, that land and I saw 9 acres of soil. And instantly, I felt that, what am I doing here? Those voices, you don't belong, this is slave work, what are you doing here? And I had 2 options: either get back on the plane and go back to New York or face your demons. And I said to myself, Karen, the only way you're going to face this and get the sense of belonging is to go up to the soil. And so, Natalie, this is exactly what I did. I went up to the soil and put both my hands into the soil, and instantly I felt that connection of belonging. It's something, I don't know what it was, some impulse said that, you know what, you belong here. And during that 6-month time, I was like a sponge. I took in everything, you know, I wanted to learn about everything, how to grow things and how to do it organically. I stayed up and did a lot of work and research. And so when I came back to New York, I was ready. I was determined to find some land, made a promise that one day with some friends, I would find some land to grow. But also, while I was there, I started to look at the landscape. The question that I asked was, where are the farmers that look like me?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's 2 things: my sense of belonging, that I knew that somehow I was going to pursue farming, but then I wanted to find out more about the essence of a Black farmer, because like you said, the pictures have always been this white farmer, male. And yet, if you know the history of farming globally, is predominantly people of color and women. And that was a question that I had to find the answer for.
Mm, mm. And how did you find the answer for that?
Well, while I was there in California, each of us had to do a project. And the project that I sort of came upon was that question, where are the Black farmers? And at that time, I don't know if you know her, Charlene Gilbert put out a documentary called The Homecoming. It was about her experience, her family experience being a Black farmer. And so I wanted to sort of piggyback on that film by asking the question, like, where are the Black farmers in my region? So I had sent out an email to the corporate extension in New York State, asking about the number of Black farmers, and didn't hear. Eventually, I was able to call them. And so I said, I'm doing this research project. I need to know how many Black farmers are in New York State. So he starts off by saying, well, there are 56,000 farmers in New York State. And so the next, answer I was expecting to say, and this is the amount of farmers. And to my surprise, when he said there's only 116 Black farmers, I said, well, so explain this to me. There are 57,000 farmers, and you're telling me only 116 are Black? He said, yes. And so, well, how many are white? And he says 55,000. And so right then and there, I just dropped the phone and I was just dumbfounded. Yeah. And then started to reach out and look at the census in other states, and some states had no Black farmers, and came back and said, this is something that has to be reckoned with. Yeah. We're in this class, and in this environment, this farming environment. And at that time, people were talking about, food justice and diversity. And that meant nothing. That meant nothing when for our entire life, we have been shunned from the truth. The truth is that, again, as Africans, where was our history and our involvement in agriculture and farming?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and this is one of the things that it was really one of the reasons why I wrote We Are Each Other's Harvest, right? And because I was thinking about even my own experience of the narrative of farming. And when I think about, the images that I grew up with, right? Laura Ingalls, Little House on the Prairie, right? I think about the Farm Aid concerts that were popular in the 80s. I think about a lot of the movies that, there was one with Sally Fields or something, I don't remember, but the narrative around who is farming in this country, who is involved in agriculture, who are the land stewards. It's shocking to think how Black and brown people have been left out of that conversation, and they've been left out of that narrative. And I know that in my work as a storyteller and as a writer, I really wanted to say to people, wait a minute, the way we have been raised to think about this is all skewed. And if we just look back at our families, if we look back at our family histories, we can find evidence of our own expertise, right? Of our own experience. And really, I was trying to celebrate that in this book and get people to really rethink the stories that we have been told and that we are telling ourselves about our participation in this American experiment, right?
Natalie, this is why your book and your voice is so important. You, like so many other Black authors, are now coming to talk about the Black experience, not only in terms of farming, but in the culinary experience as well. We need you. We need people like you to unmask the harm, unmask the trauma, unmask the lies and falsehoods that have been permeating throughout history. And now we have legislation that is trying to control critical racial theory and preventing the truth. Your book and authors like you, we need them more than ever to really set the record straight so that people understand how this country's wealth, this country's culinary skills, this country's agricultural skills and techniques was built on the backs of enslaved and indigenous people.
Yes.
And it's hard for people to, get especially whites, to get a hold of that, but you cannot keep us from denying the truth. I mean, again, like I said, I could not put your book down. I've got about a couple of pages left to read, but it gave me a sense of a powerful sense of belonging, of someone now is telling the narrative of so many farmers that have been in the trenches, and also talking about the hurdles that we had to go through. But at the end of the day, the perseverance, the resiliency of Black people and Black farmers, so many times we've been put down, but Lord have mercy, we have found a way to continue to rise and to continue to be there. And I think the message that your book, for me, has shown that, you know what? At the end of the day, there's a new wave of Black and brown people that want to farm, that want to know the truth. And you have opened Pandora's box to seek that truth. And I'm so proud of the work that you've done.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about two things. I would love to hear your thoughts on this returning generation, these young people who are recognizing what farming represents. Leah Penniman and Naima Penniman, who we both know and love, who were on the cover of this book. I chose them because I wanted this book to be, the cover to say to people, this experiment is not over, right? We are looking forward. These young women represent the future of agriculture, the future of farming. But I would love to hear from you also. You know Naima and Leah, and you know the work that they're doing. What is it like for you as someone who has led this movement, who commands such respect from this new generation of farmers? I would love you to talk about your experience of them. I just saw them 2 days ago up at Soul Fire and was reinvigorated over again with what they're doing and their vision for the future. But you have really been walking alongside them. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that. And then I want to talk about the new legislation.
Yes, so now you know my name is Mama K. So that's my name, that I'm owning that. And first of all, I want to give homage and I want to give thanks and praise to so many of the rural farmers that have struggled for decades and centuries for us to find a place, because a lot of this movement is coming in urban settings. Yes. And a lot of the urban movement, the nuances that you're starting to see of young and Black and brown people, especially in cities that want to farm, comes from the narrative of the resilience of the Southern farmer that have paved the way for us to even think about farming, to even think about coming to the land, and to see the struggles that they've had, and the fact that a lot of our families left the South to come to the North thinking that, we can find a better way. But in essence, even though it was more overt in the South when it came to racism, it was still there, mostly covert, but it still existed in northern cities. And so what you're starting to see, especially in urban areas, is again, that narrative of, especially of elders, starting to say how important it was to own land, number one, but also the legacy of going back to the land, holding on to the land, because for so long we were told, we're not going back to the South. It's racism happening there. And as a result, so many of us lost land.
Yes.
We didn't want to pay the taxes. There was infighting. And so now you're seeing a younger generation, first of all, understanding their place in history. And I think that's the most important thing, is to take away that narrative, that slave mentality narrative, and put in its place a fact that we are an agrarian people, that agriculture is in our DNA, the color of our skin is soil. And so now you see this new movement of young people that are no longer listening to the falsehood, because they're digging for the truth and they understand the truth, and they're letting that truth set them free. And as a result, they're starting to understand the power of putting hands in the soil, the power of controlling your own food. When you talk about food justice and food sovereignty, it's about self-governance. It's about being self-reliant, self-sufficient. And I think what COVID has done is really open the eyes of so many people to understand that in order to fight viruses in general, is to be healthy and eat healthy. And that by eating healthy and being healthy is controlling your food system. And that now people understand this next wave of people understanding is like, you know what? We got to get some land and we got to grow some food, because last year, my email and phone was off the hook. People asking for the first time, how do I turn my backyard into growing spaces, my front yard? How do I grow on a windowsill on a terrace? How do I grow something? And so this movement, like you said, has exploded. Again, your book has really opened the door. And I don't think, and I know for a fact that people are not going to go back with the same sort of narrative that they've heard time and time again about slavery and about land ownership. It's about empowerment. It's about legacy. It's about history. It's about going back to the land.
Yeah. And you know what you just said about what this pandemic opened up for people, right? When you go into, when I know, because we all had a similar experience of walking into a store and seeing empty shelves, that is an unnerving feeling. You know, I know that people, I myself felt very vulnerable all of a sudden, not knowing how I was going to be able to feed my family when I'm accustomed to walking into a grocery store and there's an abundance of food, and all of a sudden there was nothing on the shelves. And that was a very unnerving feeling. And I was here talking with some farmers just yesterday who were talking about the difference in their experience as farmers, right? Who were growing food, and they did not feel that same sense of panic and uncertainty that their friends and family in cities felt, right? Because they knew all they had to do was go out and harvest what they had already been growing. And to me, talking with these Black farmers and farmers of color who have been practicing these growing techniques, who have been out on the soil, they really had a much, their experience of this pandemic was really much more grounded and much more, less vulnerable than folks in the cities. I'm thinking of a couple of farmers who were in the book, Kamal Bell, Melanie Edwards, young people, right? Who are looking at farming as, just as you said, a path to self-determination, right? Something else I was thinking of yesterday, having a conversation. Part of what I was trying to say in this book is we can think about agriculture as a way to sustain ourselves, but there are also opportunities for entrepreneurship, right? When you can grow your own food, you're growing more than you can eat. There's an opportunity to be small business people. There's an opportunity to start CSAs, right, in your communities. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, about how we can not only shift the lens of how we're thinking about the past, but how we can reimagine our futures.
I'm glad you said that because I have a farm up in Chester, New York with 3 of my friends. We have 6 acres, 3 acres that we're growing food on. And, we realize that as farmers, as young farmers, I will include myself into that phrase, is that you have to think outside the raised beds. You have to think about farming differently. You just can't, first of all, our farm is a for-profit farm, it's not a nonprofit farm, because we want to find a way to make farming profitable. And so when you set out, we realize that you just can't just grow food and sell it. You have to be somewhat innovative. So what we've done is that, so we grow food, we have farmers markets, but we also, what we try to do is that we have farm tours. And then all of us have an educational component in farm school. We also are trying to find a way to do more agro-tourism, more education in terms of just growing food. And so this nuance in this farming agricultural movement, it's more than just growing food. It's really, you have to do education. An educational component has to be on your farm, especially farms of color, or farms that are run by women, farms that are run by LGBTQ women, where there's a totally different history and knowledge that needs to be explored. Having our farm also as a healing farm, where you now selling and also inviting people who are herbalists. So we grow medicinal herbs, culinary herbs, having, again, conversations around medicinal herbs. But I think also is inviting, so our farm is on the Lenape land, and inviting indigenous people to come back on the land and looking at the land, not in terms of ownership. And I think that's a new thing that people, especially young people, are looking at land, not owning land, but being stewards of the land. So the language is starting to change, so that people are starting using words like sustainability, how do we become stewards of the land, all those things, instead of thinking about just farming. And also forming cooperatives. Another thing, even though within our farm is part of this Chester Agricultural Center, even though they're individual farms with their farm business, we still farm, the 5 farms are there, we farm cooperatively. And so again, taking a model and really expanding on it.
Yeah. I think that's essential. I do sense that there is a push to rethink some of the ways that we are engaging in, economic structures, right? People are thinking more, just as I think people are looking for ways to interact with their communities more than they have in the past. It really is, and I think it goes back to, the title of the book, right? Part of the reason I chose that title for this book, We Are Each Other's Harvest, is because I really wanted to communicate a sense of community, right? And a sense of us all moving forward together and taking care of each other together, right? This isn't something that you can do as individuals.
And I think that's really
well, I would love to know.
A good part of your book, talking about community. I got that out of it. I got that out of it in terms of the community. Again, farming, you can't farm alone. I mean, young people are starting to look at ways of farming together in community, which is really important.
Yeah. Karen, I would love to get your impressions of the new legislation from the Biden administration to help Black farmers, Black and brown farmers. And I would love to hear your thoughts on some of the pushback that the administration has gotten from banks and other lending institutions who are claiming that they're not going to make as much money What do you think about that?
You know, there's always, look at our history, there's always been obstacles from banks, from legislations that have kept Black farmers from obtaining capital. It just, you know, and this is why from time to time again, even though the Biden administration through the USDA is trying to do this, again, those are just words. We've been through this before. We've been down this road before, whereby the government sets up these opportunities for Black and brown people, and yet time and time again to go through that paperwork. It, you know, you need a college degree to go through. They don't make it simple. You have to not only bring so many papers, but sometimes put up collateral. You have to look at credit. There's so much that you have to do in order to even think about getting a grant or a loan from the federal government.
Yeah.
They have to make it easier. That's number one. And number two, we have to make sure that when legislation is brought before Black people, that it doesn't disregard or create a problem that pits Blacks against Indigenous people. You know, and we need to have that conversation. So when this land is given out to people, it's given out to Black, brown, Indigenous people, so that so it doesn't set up that we're fighting against each other. You know, and
Yes.
so, and also the training, the technical education, the broadband that continues to be exclusive in terms of, again, a lot of farmers, especially farmers of color in rural areas, don't have broadband, don't have access to the internet. To talk about reparations, what does that look like to talk about reparations? Because, you know, as soon as you mention reparations, white folks get up in arms, you know, like they're coming to take our land. No, we need to have that hard conversation about the land that you got. How did you get that land? You know, and there are whites who are willing, that know their history and are willing to give up that land. So how do we develop a land bank so that that land is distributed amongst people of color, Indigenous people, fairly? Another thing, again, is capital and resources. How do we give, and again, not about loans, we're tired of loans, because loans you got to pay back. How about grant money, especially for startup farmers from the very beginning, and technical resources and information is really, really critical and important. Again, the Biden administration is coming up with this sort of legislation, is having these listening sessions. But again, how do we make sure that we don't replicate the oppressor as we move forward? And how do we make sure that there's accountability and transparency in all of these legislations that are coming before us?
Yeah. Well, I know we need to go to the Q&A, but I do want to say, just a couple of days across this article in the Counter, the magazine, The Counter, that Cynthia Greenlee runs. And she posted about one of the listening sessions that Secretary of Agriculture Vilsack was on somewhere here in the South. And I was encouraged to hear that in response, somebody asked him a question about, you know, the pushback and the objections that the USDA is receiving on, you know, from banks and lenders who have been preying on people of color all this time. And I thought it was interesting that he would say, now maybe these, you know, white farmers will understand what it means to be left out. He's thinking that maybe now finally, you know, as the USDA pushes forward to make these changes, they're not going to be deterred in addressing these generations of wrong. But I thought it was interesting that he would really articulate a desire to do the right thing, but that also he's saying, you know, white folks have been getting this stuff forever, and maybe now they'll understand what it means to be sidelined. So I just thought that was an interesting stance for him to take.
again, transparency and accountability at the end of the day. Let's see what these banks do. I mean, just through COVID, how many of us try to get loans from banks, and all of a sudden people with power and privilege were able to get the loans, and then the little guy, the small business, couldn't get any loans because the bank said, oh, they ran out of the money. And so again, you know what, we've learned to walk cautiously when it comes to any sort of government program. I'm glad he said that. Time will tell.
Time will tell. Yeah. Well, let's go to some questions. I think Nia's going to moderate that.
Thank you both for this conversation. I'm just so excited to hear you two speak together. And I'm learning so much as well. And I see we have a bunch of questions that are coming in the Q&A. So I encourage folks who are listening, if you do have questions, please add them. We have a question. Someone's wondering, how do young people acquire land? And what does how would one get started with making farming into a sustainable career?
How we got land, believe it or not, is to continue to start asking. You know, I have been asking for land for years, and only to see white young people get land. And I kept on saying, why they get land? I'm not getting land. And so I tell people time and time again, you have to make it known, put it out to the universe. And we were able to get land because we continue to say we wanted land, and someone heard us. Someone gave me a number, say, call this, and we were able to get land. So again, put it out in the universe. Do not be afraid to tell people, you know, your hopes and your dreams, because believe it or not, someone might hear it. And so that's how we got. That's the sort of recommendations I always give to young people thinking about farming and getting land, but making sure that, you know, it's one thing to get land. Is it agricultural land? Does it have access to water? Is the soil good? Be very, very careful about trying just to get land, and then there's no resources as water or the soil isn't good. So just be careful about that.
Well, and I would also add to that, earlier this week, we were up at Soul Fire Farm, and we were asking Leah about this, Leah Pennyman. And her advice was to young people who want to farm, don't necessarily run out and get land first. She said the more important thing to do is to get the training first. Become an apprentice to a farmer. See if you can work with, you know, a more experienced farmer. And I thought that that was really wise advice, because we want to set people up for success, right? And as much as it's as tempting as it is to acquire the land first, you also have to know what you're doing. And I think Leah's book, Farming While Black, is actually an excellent manual that walks you through all of the things that you need to take into consideration as you are looking for land. But I also appreciated her advice to understand this is a process, right? And running out and acquiring land, which is expensive anyway, is not necessarily the thing that's going to set you up for success. So if you can apprentice to a farmer who has more experience, invest the time in learning from them and getting those practical skills, then when you do get land, you're more likely to succeed. And the other thing I would say is on the Soulfire website, they have what's called a reparations map, right? Where people who have donated land are making that land available for Black farmers or Black and brown farmers. So, you know, if you're at that stage, I think that that's a great resource. But I really did value her advice to move into this gradually and learn from people with more experience first before you just jump out there.
I think that's excellent advice, and it kind of speaks to another question that an audience member had, which was exactly what considerations does one need to make before jumping into farming? So I think you spoke to that directly, but if there's any other elements either of you would share in terms of what considerations people should think about.
I think also if you have land in your family,
yes,
make sure you keep the land, pay the taxes. get that information, because so many of, as we speak, Black land is being lost. And so I try to tell young people, especially people of color that know that they have family land, hold on to that land. It's your legacy, find out who has to pay the taxes and do the right thing to hold on to that land. But I think what we said before, I think teaming up with a well-educated farmer to learn from them is really the key before setting out and trying to do it on your own, and ask questions.
Great, thank you. There's a couple questions for you, Karen, both kind of about how you started your co-owned farm, what that was like starting a collaborative project, and then also whether or not you have residencies on your land.
Yeah, so it started, so it's four of us, we're four friends. We sort of run the farm through consensus. We have 6 acres. We lease the acres. We have a 30-year renewable lease. I'm 67, 30 years is not happening. I'll be 97, that's not happening. A 30-year renewable lease, which is really unheard of. And so that's how we got the land, I put it out, we got the land there. And then the second, what was the second question about?
Yeah, if you have visitors who can come.
Oh, yes. So we don't have facilities yet for people to stay over, but we have community days. So the last Saturday of each month, starting in June, we have community days where it runs from 10 to 1, 10 to 12, you're doing farming aerobics. That means you're getting down and dirty and you are working. And then from noon to 1 is Q&A and lunch. And the reason why we had that, because a lot of us know so many people in New York City, and at one point people were coming every day up to the farm. And even though we love visitors, people have to understand that when you visit a farm, it takes away from the business of farming. And so we had to set days and time for our friends and our family to come up and be intentional. We can give them 100% of our knowledge and being with us. So yeah, Rise of Rule. The next is the end of June of this month is Pride Day. So folks, if you're in the area, New York, it's only an hour and 15 minutes from New York City to our farm. Come up and visit us.
Wonderful, thank you. And we can also share your website information in the chat as well, so people can look that up. And Natalie, so your book really, explores the history of farming in this country. And so someone actually has a question: to what extent does sharecropping still exist within the Black community, or the Black farming community? So if you could kind of share an answer to that, or how it's evolved, what farming is now.
I don't really, I would not define what's happening now as sharecropping, right? I mean, sharecropping was a whole system of subjugation, included disenfranchising Black farmers, right? I mean, that was a system where you were totally dependent upon the landowner, right? You had credit at the store, you had to pay off, that credit by the end of the year. I mean, it was really debt peonage. And I would not define what is happening with Black farmers today as anything close to sharecropping. I would say that there are Black farmers who are leasing land, right? And so there is, I'm thinking of some of the farmers in the book who told stories of, not having access to the same quality of land that some of their counterparts have, right? I'm thinking of the Nelson family in Sondheim, Louisiana, and part of their story was about how they are dry farmers, right? Their land is not irrigated, right? And yet they are hugely successful farming about their traditional commodity farmers, but they are farming and are as successful or more successful than their counterparts who have better land, right? So when we talk about the inequalities and the injustices today, it really has more to do with a lack of access to capital, right? The barriers to entry are higher for Black farmers. The requirements in terms of collateral are higher, but I would not define it as sharecropping today. That I think is in the past.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that answer, Natalie. And that, I think that also speaks to a question we got on the Facebook Live where someone's asking about or sharing their personal experience with agricultural nonprofits that are located in Black communities but not run by Black people, and their difficulty as a Black person, I think, I don't want to assume, but their difficulty being able to work for a nonprofit, if you have any advice for navigating those situations. And I think it again speaks to issues of access.
Don't let me get started. Because the nonprofit movement needs to get out of Black and brown communities. You know, I think for so long they have been pimping off of us. I mean, especially those that come into our communities, been there 15, 20 years under the guise of leadership development, and you still there. You're still there. The high echelon of people are still white. The people that work for you are Black, and yet you ask the Black people that work for you to go into our communities and get volunteers. No, you know, it's time to, I always say that the heart and soul of the nonprofits, especially in the food movement, they live in our community. And as long as we are poor and sick, they're making money off of us, because how do they get their grants? They get their grants because the people are poor or they're sick, and they're using that sort of mission to sort of, we're here to help people get out of poverty. It's like, no, you need to start handing over the power. For me, it's always the power dynamics. Is handing over the power and the reins back into the hands of the people that need to start taking control of their food, of the food system, the economic system. And I'm not trying to be facetious, but you know, it's time for people to move on and put power back into the hands of communities.
Absolutely. And thank you both. I know there's other questions that are still here, but we are getting to the top of the hour. But I'll just close with this one. And someone is asking how to support you both. And so I want to kind of broaden that. If there's any other work that you're both doing, ways that people can either financially support your work or learn more about ways to be engaged, if you can share that. And I'll also share your website links in the chat too.
Karen, you want to go first?
Yeah, Black Pharma Fund. We started Black Pharma Fund. It's like the sister to what Natalie's going to talk about. So yes, Black Pharma Fund is in New York State, specifically helping Black farmers and businesses to get loans and grants to help start their business. So Black Pharma Fund.
The Black Farmer Fund is really an amazing organization. And what I appreciate about the work that they're doing is they are thinking about the whole vertical structure, from the farmers to food producers to restaurants. And they are so smart and savvy in the way they are thinking about implementing change. And so I support them. I'm a huge cheerleader for them. And I also started something called the Black Harvest Fund, which is it's something called a donor advised fund, meaning that it's basically my attempt to set up a foundation that will then be able to issue grants to nonprofits that are doing this work. So if you can go to my website, there's a tab there for the Black Farmer Fund. Anybody is free to donate as much or as little as whatever they can. All contributions are welcomed. Make sure that I think it now appears in the drop-down menu, so you can select the fund. But if you type it into the field that says donor advised funds, make sure you designate Black Harvest Fund, and then the funds will go to this bucket. And then my advisors and I are looking forward to issuing grants to 501c3s who are doing this work. And that's just my way of, you know, putting my money where my mouth is and making those contributions.
And I donated, so folks
You
out there.
did, Karen. I saw that. I saw that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both for this conversation. This has been absolutely wonderful to hear you two talk, share both of your experiences and your work. And so I really encourage everyone to please check out the links that I've shared in the chat to continue supporting both Karen and Natalie's work. Buy Natalie's book, read and learn, continue learning about how we can support Black farming into the future. There it is. I'll drop the link to it again in the chat. And if everyone can just take a few moments following this program to fill out our program survey, we do appreciate hearing from you. It's how we learn how to best support our communities. And if you are able to support the museum, in addition, we do appreciate that as well. And you can make donations through our website, which is moadsf.org. And I'll put the information in the chat as well. So thank you again, both. This has been an absolute joy to hear from both of you. And take care, everyone, and thank you for engaging in this.
Thank you.